Let me start out by saying my respectful appreciation to the Gadigal and Eora peoples whose lands we are on tonight, and to the Ngaanyatjarra and Warlpiri people for not only their respective permissions to share their works with you tonight, but indeed the imperative to do so in the hope that it might infect you with, in fact, what these works do. We are pawaja najaku padanka najaku koraji nyanojo. We are pawaja thanking maninjako nindako nyaralaku kujuju. So this part of the evening then is focusing on current research that we're undertaking within the Centre for Contemporary Art and Politics, or CCAP as we call ourselves. We're a UNSW research centre based here at the College of Fine Arts. We were only formed in 2003. We're this tiny little unit, and we have 2 full-time people working on Indigenous art, which is pretty impressive for a tiny little research unit. The centre was formed to promote research by art and cultural theorists, artists and curators into the contribution of visual culture to debates in current political themes and issues, and so the politics of what we're doing here really matters to us. So tonight I just want to briefly indicate something of what our current intercultural research into Indigenous art and cinema is doing and what it looks like. In this kind of research, art production is being utilised as a means to support Indigenous self-presentation and strategic development. In this work, art is not secondary to nor a representation of real politics which exist elsewhere, economy, disadvantage, intervention, but art is itself the real of new determinative and insistent forms, processes and practices of Indigenous identities in the making, including forms of survival, really. And I want to stress here the importance of making, of practice, of production of art itself, not product. As indeed the artists I work most closely with stress themselves, that it's not what the dreaming means, but how it is made and remade that both distinguishes it as a unique cultural practice and ensures its continual renewal in the present. So it's how, not what, it's about making. So therefore experimentation, and you know, I really stress experimentation specifically in remote area art production, because in fact it's almost, you know, a contradiction in terms. Somehow experimentation is supposed to reside with the urban and urban artists and what goes on in the cosmopolitan, but in fact experimentation is critical, specifically in traditional artworks. So it's not an elaboration or a strategy that's somehow on top of the real of tradition. Rather, experimentation makes knowledge mediated. It makes it able to be repeated, reinvented, made meaningful, potent and relevant through practice in the present, so experiment is crucial. It's no longer enough to simply record, document or preserve culture, people tell me constantly. Culture is not static, and nor is the dreaming a fixed or final canon in any sense, as any amount of recent contemporary art insists. If the success of Aboriginal art has demonstrated any one thing, it is that new media and techniques of aesthetic production can provide the means to re-engage the past in the present. So as I said, we're looking at process-oriented experimental arts, not product-focused art, in line with the traditions from which they derive. In this sense, the research we're conducting here departs from dominant paradigms of art history and art theory, as well as from media representations, which privilege analyses of Indigenous artworks as unique visual symbols or meanings, stories, myths, landscapes, oral histories, which are, in a sense, of the past. The projects we are undertaking locate works of art contemporarily as distinctive ways of doing and being in the world in the present, distinctive ways of doing and being which are currently otherwise marginalised, misrepresented, silenced, or simply not available in any other form. I'm sure it goes without saying in this very privileged and esteemed environment. But it's of course not arbitrary that art has become so critical for Indigenous peoples and cultures here and elsewhere. Art allows people to represent themselves on their own terms and in their own terms without relinquishment, full stop. That is, without learning, conforming, or adapting to forms of representation not of their own control or not of their own making. So what is at stake then in these projects is the right to creatively revive otherwise threatened languages, traditions and identities, to enliven collective memories, reclaim colonised histories, and ultimately to envision alternative futures. Specifically then in relationship to tonight's focus on the remote, and by means of some explanation of the intentional title of my own part of tonight's presentation, that is, Remote Avant-Garde, these art projects demonstrate that Indigenous futures are taking shape in remote Australia, in which speaking an Indigenous language is not a deficit, in which communities are not dysfunctional, and where a community-based existence is a crucial part of what it means to be Aboriginal and indeed to be Australian today. Our research projects take shape in a context where, as Pat Dobson has recently put it, what is sorely needed in current national consciousness and public debate are models in which, quote, living in the bush becomes an advantage, not an impediment to your opportunities, unquote. So just as a really broad umbrella, two things about what distinguishes the research that I'm going to be showing you tonight, and really which forms the sort of approach that the Centre's been undertaking, at least to date, is that first of all, it's based on forms of social research in which long-term anthropological field research and collaborative partnerships and relationships are stressed. And this means no longer a matter of simply a white anthropologist, which of course I am, who studies them, but rather new methods and means in which community-determined needs, aspirations and imaginations are conjoined synergistically, where aspirations and imaginations are supported and developed through jointly conceived and conducted research projects. This isn't easy. And in which anthropological knowledge and expertise can be drawn upon, utilised in order to make things happen literally, materially, through art itself. And secondly, where art production itself then, from local production of film, photography, new media, painting, to the reception of these works in national and global forums and context of exhibition, is the primary data of the so-called research. So art and art production itself becomes what we are also researching. So there's also a synergistic way in which then intellectual knowledge gets fed back into art production. So again, it's not a simple matter of us knowing stuff that they don't. It's about that form of collaborative exchange and involvement. So what I'm going to do now is tell you a little bit about Jennifer Deger and her work, and discuss and show you two little films that she's been producing collaboratively in the last 4 years. Jennifer's been working with Yolngu people, so Arnhem Land. Gapawiak is a little community, so north and west up there. So amongst Jennifer's other achievements, under CCAP, Jennifer's established the first media production unit at Gapawiak in 2008. She established the unique Miraka Media in 2009, devoted explicitly to intergenerational media production. She's facilitated media training and job facilitation in filmmaking, editing and post-production at Gapawiak Culture and Arts Centre, and she's co-directed and produced with Yolngu a suite of experimental films, including Jalkari 1 and 2. I don't speak Yolngu, so excuse my pronunciation, which premiered at her sole-curated exhibition called Interventions, which was at the Australian Anthropological Association at Macquarie University in 2009. So Jennifer's work has followed on from the seminal research of Eric Michaels and Marcia Langton in the 1980s and the so-called Aboriginal invention of television, in which, during this time at least, Warlpiri, in fact, were understood to be bypassing literacy and directly entering into the electronic and digital age with no small aplomb, fighting fire with fire, as Japaljarri famously put it, by taking the camera into their own hands literally and thus mitigating against the detrimental impact of television on local languages and tradition under the threat of institutionalised media imperialism, especially when that AllSat satellite first went up into the sky and started beaming down television to remote communities for the first time. So Jennifer's work departed from that and took up that argument explicitly. And she's worked with Yolngu and Gapawiak for over 15 years as both an ethnographer and a collaborator in making media, producing local film and television, and exploring what seeing like Yolngu looks like, feels like, sounds like, smells like, as she says, in ways beyond cultural salvage or archiving the what has been. Her research, as she puts it, is not simply about recording old people's stories for prosperity, but rather it demonstrates how Yolngu use electronic media to evoke, connect, and ultimately to reconstitute embodied relationships between the image, the imaged, and the viewer. Her collaborative films demonstrate how cultural modalities of vision apprehend and affirm often invisible connections between people, place, and things by making them visible for the first time. So it's something about the use and innovation of experimental forms which makes us see tradition anew. Her works link ritual practice and everyday ways of being in the world with new ways of seeing and knowing, and media technologies critically mediate and enable the revelation of new means of renewing physical and emotional connections between kin, sacred site, objects, and indeed the so-called ancestral past and the contemporary present. Not arbitrarily, her works also instigate new intercultural fields of exchange and relation between Yolngu and Balanda, that is, between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. I should have apologised earlier too for Jennifer Deger not being able to be here tonight. She's actually in Gapawiak shooting. There's 1,000 things I could say about that. I'm going to say just one or two things. Firstly is simply how crucial film is proving to be for Indigenous people in what Vivian Shogunchak would call simply its unique capacity of film to capture experience by means of experience. For here it's not a story or a place so much which is conjured through the sonorous magic of film sensorium. Rather, this is a deeply embedded and embodied encounter and experience, rendered even more so in this particular version of the film of Gulari by the absence of subtitling and translation. This is an earlier community version currently under reproduction to include family members who could not participate when the film was initially shot due to the suicide of a young family member. Thus, even this Karma premiered and Karma supported and co-produced film, which premiered in 1998 on Karma TV, remains itself a process-based art form. It's still being remade, responsive and responsible to the community it represents. This film then is not a simple show and tell of a traditional story, and nor is it straightforward documentary by any means of what does it ultimately tell us, what does it ultimately show us. This film, it seems to me, rather than showing or telling anything as such, it brings into being what it purports to be about. It brings into being itself what it's supposedly about in ways that ensure highly localized and deeply specific kinds of identifications, places, peoples, sounds, movements. That is, this is profoundly located aesthetics in the terms that Clifford Geertz has described. For people who know this country and know the people it evokes, and represents. This is not water as such flowing, but this is water flowing in this direction, in this place. Not any voice singing, but that old man, Miri Warndangu, sorry, my pronunciation again. Great-grandfather, uncle, mothers, brothers, fathers, a specific person. So this very localized, specific story takes shape for us, in turn, as intercultural engagement. It takes shape more through song, sound, movement, and light, through animation and animating than it does through vision. What Laura Marx would call a bodily intelligence is evoked rather than rational or strictly visual forms of knowledge and knowing that dominate Western scholarship and our visuality. The surface of the water here is amplified, focused upon its movement literally across country, suffusing the landscape here as our bodies become animated and suffused by it. The sounds of water moving in itself, with the non-sync recording of ancestral songs and the stamping of feet and the calling out to country, evokes our response in turn. We are heard and made to hear. The country is called out to, alived, and called out to as sentient as Stenner originally identified the country, that is, as itself already alive and responsive and responding to the life worlds of human. See that shimmer in the water, see that animation of ancestral presence, see it come into life by that calling out, by that sound. So here we feel more than we see, caught up by and in, more than we are known, more than we know or learn cognitively by watching. The absence of translation and subtitling and the very discomfort that it causes, and that's certainly true if you were to watch the rest of the 25 minutes, is important, and I'm really interested in discomfort generally in new forms of experimental art. Something else has to happen, something else has to be paid attention to. The rhythmic presence of song and its beckons, the cadence and grit of voice, the sheer affect of that calling out, the water itself that begins to sing, ensures an amplification of our affect, our sensation. We attend to our senses literally more because we cannot understand cognitively. Affect becomes the point in portraying a story otherwise unknowable and untellable and untranslatable ultimately to outsiders. We become a witness instead to a very different kind of encounter. I just want to show you this other film quickly, just to show you that that's not all that they're making up there, that mob. This film was shot on CCAP Ethnographic Media Lab equipment by Jennifer Deger and Susan Marawakmer and their children over Christmas this last year, and edited on Jennifer's laptop. Obviously, it's a very rough film in many ways, but it's about a convergence of intercultural synergies, which I think are really interesting. Neither one thing or another, but both, and then some more. I really love this film, even though it's rough and problematic, because of its subtle nose snubbing really to dominant representations of Aboriginal ceremony and high notions of ritual. Here, ceremony and tradition, specifically Yolngu ones, are as mundane, as profane and everyday as that we ourselves do here. Otherwise, suburban everydayness of decorating houses, trees, Christmas, tacky tedium, etc. More perversely and witty and audacious, yet this little film strikes me because, of course, reindeer Santa and the whole snow thing couldn't be more far from the supposed lived realities of Yolngu and remote Australia and northern Australia, and yet are, and Christmas is big where I work in the Central Desert too. Or is it, you know? This film asks, collapsing distinctions it raises again anew. Here, there, or is it otherwhere? Who knows? The sacred, the day-to-day reality of life in Arnhem Land is instantly refigured for us. This film makes the fait accompli facticity of the Indigenous sacred that I know best, that is, as I first learned it in first-year anthropology, and have been learning it ever since, is that there is no distinction between the sacred and the profane in these societies, at least in my experience. And yet not, for this Christmas ritual is like and not like ours yet again. What's with the photographs, the face, the young man, the family portraits, time and time and time again? Well, I can give you the ethnographic explanation in part. I mean, I'm not Jennifer and I don't work with this mob, but I do know that what she would say, because I've heard her say this, is that this film is also about the death of Jennifer's film collaborator of Christmas, who died a year ago at Christmas before this film was shot. The family who co-made this film with Jennifer's father, grandfather, big important person in that family. and the way in which his presence literally can be memorialised through film and photography. And this film is also part of an ongoing, very long project of research that she's doing with Yolngu, in which they're exploring new bereavement practices through film and photography, and therefore working, if you like, against the tradition and the taboo on the restriction of photographs of the dead particularly. And again, I'm serious about how experimentation reveals what matters in tradition in lots of ways. So rather than a taboo, her work demonstrates, and the filmic work that the Yolngu are doing, is ways of harnessing film and photographs to bring back and ensure ancestral presence and literally the presence of the dead in the everyday, in the right and proper forms of ways. I could also give you the ethnographic explanation that thus in this film, like the ways in which water itself also is brought to shimmer, to shine, to animate, to bring the ancestral past into the present, demonstrates how cinematic experimentation makes visible, animates and intensifies and illuminates what can be known and seen in a flash, or nula now, or in a flash, as urban Aboriginal people say. That is, it brings into being what is. But I'll leave this up to you to decide. I'm going to turn now to talk a little bit about my own work in the Central Desert of Australia, where I've been working on and working with female artists in a community called Lajamanu, which is actually about 600 kilometres north of Yuendamu and about 300 kilometres west of Papunya. So it's Warlpiri community. Warlpiri people live in Papunya as well. And I've been working on a sort of development of this idea of a kind of feminisation of the dreaming, redressing the bias of the almost exclusive focus on male artists and artworks in the history of the Papunya Tula, or Western Desert art movement, as it also is called. Specifically, unlike women's artworks, are said to come directly from the body. Men's art, if you ask them about it, will talk about ground paintings that people have done. Women will always talk about the designs that they've put traditionally on their bodies in the central and western part of Australia. These designs are repeated when women apply them to canvas. The techniques of painting in my research turn canvas to skin to country. Skin in my work has been a conduit, or is seen by the women that I work with as a conduit for ancestral potency. This might sound a little crude, but in the media at the moment, Aboriginal sexuality is habitually represented, if it's represented at all, in negative ways. In 2007, the intervention itself was based on the former Prime Minister's reaction to the report, The Little Children Are Sacred, which catalogued rampant child sexual abuse in remote communities. My research has asked instead, where are the stories of pleasure and intimacy, the productive, positive effects of a sensualised landscape, a sentient, emotional, bounded and immediate relationship between country and person? Why does feeling matter to the work of desert painting? Is there not a politics and insistence of attachment, beholden relation, and enlivening relationships in the work of art? What are those binding relationships, and how do we know them and see them through work? To this end, I've conducted a series of residencies in Sydney with Warlpiri women at their instigation, exploring the relationship between art and touch, embodied memory and made relatedness through art. In 2007, I brought 6 Warlpiri women to a residency here at CCAP COFA under an Australian Research Council grant, exploring the role of touch and texture through experimental works of ochre, charcoal, oil and acrylic on board and canvas. This work was also research that I've been doing for a very long time on women's art specifically. And it resulted in an exhibition entitled Yalyu, which means Women's Ceremonial Body Designs. 17 works on paper and 19 works on board. These yurkurukuru boards, which are used by women in traditional dancing ceremonies of Yalyu. The opening of this exhibition was attended by over 300 people and launched by the then Northern Territory Minister for Arts, Marion Scrigmore, who we're not so happy with because, after all, she was the instigator of the end of bilingual education in the Northern Territory. Yalyu is currently staged to exhibit at the prestigious US Aboriginal Art Gallery Kluge-Ruhe in West Virginia in 2012 as part of greater transnational research on art reception and not just on its production that I'm concerned and interested in. I'm really interested in the kind of circuits between production and consumption and that feedback loop again. These are a few of the works that were produced during the CCAP residency. I'm currently undertaking a research project under the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies with Warnayaka Arts in Lajamanu on intergenerational art production, exploring the use of ochre-based technologies in new forms out of this same project. My research has extended into work which concerns relationships between art forms and what I want to call sort of social literacy. Current policy tells us that Aboriginal people can't and don't write, and that alarming rates of literacy predominate in remote areas, that without early childhood literacy and programs, and specifically the now mandatory English-only programs that we have in the Northern Territory, Aborigines will remain illiterate, if not pre-literate. To the contrary, however, Warlpiri claimed that there are distinctive forms of Aboriginal history of writing found not on pages or books, but rather on the ground, on the body, in ceremony, represented on paintings. The vernacular terms that Warlpiri, Ngaanyatjarra and other desert artists use to describe their works are better translated, indeed, as writing than as art. Traces, marks, imprints, law, truth, fact. So my current research has been documenting the predominance of visual and social literacies already operant, from traditional body designs to acrylic painting, but also so-called graffiti and rock song lyrics, text messaging, religious and every other day uses of existent visual, post-traditional and contemporary modern practices of art that combine writing. That includes work I'm doing at the moment, haptic technologies and techniques of new visual media, mobile phones, thumbing and point and click of computer-based technologies, in order to understand something about the preference for electronic visual-based forms of literacy and the preference in turn for the haptic specificities and the material qualities of paint itself. And again, you know, Yalyul, this traditional ceremony and these body practices that women do in the central and western part of Australia extends to the use of religious iconography. This is a painting that was produced on ochre here at CCAP, on ochre itself, using religious iconography in the development of so-called painting, and the synergies between writing and painting that are developing. And they have historically, there's been a very long history in the central and western desert of using painting as a means to communicate and convey all kinds of information about things like social problems, petrol sniffing, by Nananpa Health and many other Aboriginal organisations. Recently I've been looking at the work of June Wakajukul Richards, and in fact there's an article in this month's monthly of mine on June's work, which is about precisely this complex and experimental forms of new art in which words are being used in acrylic, and the kind of breaking away from the sort of the high-end market only of the dreaming as the only predominant form of painting practice. So, in short, the kind of recent research we've been doing supports, or that I've been doing, supports forms of Indigenous art that don't only belong to old people, as Lajamana youth now describe acrylic painting, by supporting and researching newer art forms which both continue and transform tradition, rather than accepting an either-or perspectivalism, the kind which has seen elder members of the community responsible for tradition and younger members responsible or solely associated with modernity, or what Eric Michaels first called the split between the old and black fella business and the young and white fella business. My work is trying to bring attention to new forms of emerging arts in which synergies between the old and the young, tradition and modernity, the sacred and the new, are occurring. Thus, dispelling idealised version of the Western Desert painting movement is only concerned, again, with the high-end market focus of tradition dreaming, where painting can and is being turned to history of the present, of community and of life worlds making in the now.